All right, guys. Today we're going to talk about shading in charcoal. And up to this point, we've done a lot more work in graphite than in charcoal. But charcoal has a lot of positives, a lot of good attributes to it. And one is that it's really efficient. You can get deep, dark values really fast, and it's very versatile in the sense that you can blend it, erase, and make changes way easier than some other materials. So let me show you what I mean by that. So one, we're going to be working from this image today, real simple still life with a mug and a couple apples. When I start out my line drawing, and I'll ask you guys to bring your drawing to this level, just to save time, I've thrown the line drawing out. I like to use Vine charcoal to begin with. So Vine I use first because this is a really light wispy charcoal. And when you go to make line work, let's say I'm sketching something out and I make some sort of mistake, it's really easy to change. So even though that looks pretty solid on here, I can wipe it with my finger and it almost goes away. Now with a kneaded eraser, I can almost go all the way back to the white of the page, which is nearly unheard of if you go with a really dark pencil, graphite pencil or a dark charcoal pencil. So that makes it really easy to make changes. And I could do the same thing here. If I don't like something, let's say the top of this mug, very easy to erase out and get back to nearly the white of the page, which is awesome. It's really versatile for that sense. Now you can also begin to shade some with a Vine. It's very light and wispy and easy to make messy marks with, which can be great, and you can embrace that. It's great for toning your page, but again, you can come back and erase out highlights. Now that was just a kneaded eraser. You could come in with something like a pink pearl and really erase out more. So that's the Vine. Super light, super versatile. Charcoal pencils, great for line work too and details. But the downside is if you make that line work with the charcoal pencil, it's not going to be nearly as blurry or easily smudged. And it's way harder to erase. You'll always be able to see some of that. And that's a lighter pencil, a hard. You could get hard, medium, soft. So these are softer ones. And the softer pencils will go really dark really quickly. A little easier to blur too because they're a softer lead, quote unquote. Um, Now, keep in mind, again, charcoal's pretty versatile. So even though it looks really dark, I can come in with an eraser and erase out a little bit. But the dark marks are always going to stay fairly dark on there. Pencils are great for detail work, for outlining later on in the drawing. Um, but I rarely use those to start off with. Maybe on a line drawing, but I'd prefer to use the Vine because it's so easy to erase on my lines. And then compressed comes in a bunch of different styles. So I'm going to show you two different brands here. Um, compressed is where you have a stick. Mine's round, some of them are square, and you can add a lot of value at one time. So it's great for backgrounds in big areas. Now then you can blend and smear and blur. This is also good because it'll go very, very dark with a compressed charcoal. And when we say compressed, it just means it's really compacted. And this is compressed charcoal too. It's just in a pencil form. So keep that in mind. That's why they're both pretty dark. Different brands will do different things. So this is a little bit waxier, it feels like to me, or oilier. And so it doesn't blur and blend quite as easily. I have to kind of work harder to get really, really jet black. This particular brand, I'm not sure which one this is. This is Conte of Paris. This one I'm not 100% sure anymore. I have a million different brands that I work with. Um, I don't think there's any labeling on here. But this one is a little more chalky. It smears on a little easier, and so I can get darker faster, but I bet I could erase more easily too, and we could test that out. So even though it's really dark, I can erase fairly easily. This one's going to be a little harder to pull back up and erase because this one's waxier or greasier. This one seems a little bit more chalky. Uh, every brand will have a little bit of a different consistency, so keep that in mind as you're working. Um, so let's dive into that's a little bit about the different styles that we're working with. Otherwise, your best friend is going to be your kneaded eraser. Love this. That's the best first tool to use when you're just starting to erase. Then the pink pearl would be a great option. If you notice with compressed, it's such a dark charcoal that's about as light as I'm going to get. I'll never be able to get back to the white of the page anymore. And the other eraser tool that I like to use, if I can find one, I'll bring it out later, but is a one of those retractable detail erasers for highlights and things. Um, So when you actually get started into the shading, there's a million ways to do this. So just keep in mind, I'm not trying to tell you the one right way to start a charcoal drawing because there's a thousand ways you could do this, and every artist will have their own particularities and preferences. But for me, I do a light line drawing. Now, never go too detailed on this stage because it's about to get real messy here in a second when we actually start to lay some value down. But good things to check out would be one, what are the truly brightest bright spots? And keep in mind that even though there's a lot of white in this still life, so we've got apples which are red, and there's a white mug and a white fabric, but that white fabric looks pretty dark in the background here. It's kind of gray. So I would call all of these shades of gray back here. There are two spots that look really white when I squint my eyes and look at the image, and those two are the highlights on the apple. So those are going to stay white, and notice I blocked them off very lightly. And then the right half of the mug from about here over is very white, and maybe some of this foreground right here is going to be white too. So I like to keep that in mind, what seems to be some of the darkest, or I'm sorry, the lightest areas. In the same way, you might make a couple mental notes about what's going to be really dark. So I see a stem that comes up out of this apple. It's very dark, so I'm going to make a little line here because I know it's close to jet black. The underside of the apple, right as it touches the table, is extremely dark. So I'm going to make a bit of a mental note about that. Very dark here. Where else? This left side of the apple over on this side is quite dark. So I haven't gone jet black, but I'm going to try to go fairly dark real quick, just so I kind of have that mental idea of where my deeper shadows are. So definitely shadow side of the apple, under the apple, shadow side over here are some of the deeper darks that I have. Now, I don't want to go crazy with that. I'm not going to take it all over the place, but it's just a mental note to remind myself for later. Now, beyond that, once I've gotten that done, what I really want to do is start to cover some ground here. So I want to block in the big, bold shadow shapes that I'm starting to see. And I'm going to do that with Vine charcoal first. Now, some people don't love to do this because the Vine is wispy, but what I love is it's so malleable and it's easy to block in big areas, just kind of as the reminder for, okay, what's light, what's dark, and it kind of keeps me on track. So what I'm doing is I'm laying this on using the wide side of the charcoal. So I'm laying it on like this because I can cover a lot of ground there instead of like a bunch of linear strokes. So wide, broad strokes there. So the whole apple is fairly gray, shades of gray, because it is red tones, with the exception, like we said, dog's going crazy outside, sorry guys, with the exception of a highlight area. So I'm leaving out that highlight, which is nice and bright. And I know the rest of the apple has a certain amount of gray to it. Now it really starts to fade dark over here to the left side, so I'm going to amp that up a little bit more. All right, so that's good enough just as a beginning. This isn't going to be perfect, nowhere near. It's just a beginning of light highlight, middle tones, getting into the dark. It's kind of, again, a mental reminder of where I want to go with this. Same over on this side, this apple, relatively dark. Extremely dark over on the left edge, right up against the cup. Okay, leave a little highlight so it feels kind of shiny. Again, we'll have to come back and really clean that up, but you get where it feels like a light, medium, dark, just a real basic light structure through there. Now some other key areas where I know we're going to have some big shadow shapes. This is the cast shadow that the apple leaves across the floor. It also drops a cast shadow down across the mug here. There's going to be a cast shadow back to the left side and under this mug. And for now, I'm just using my finger to blend. You could use a cloth too, but in these early stages, my finger works best for Vine charcoal is what I found. Notice how messy I'm being. Big, chunky shadow shapes. I'm not getting too caught up in the details just yet. Next big thing I'm going to do is start to block in some grays way in the background. Even though that fabric is white, I know it's mostly shades of gray because it's much darker back here than, say, the white of this mug. So what that's telling me is I need to lay some light gray tones back here in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and start to find that light gray that I need way back here. And this will take a minute, so I'm just going to go for it. Okay, guys, so notice how loose I was in blocking out that tone. I almost used like the same type of a gray tone across the whole background. Now I have to come in and I'll bring in more wrinkle textures and things like that for the wrinkles of the fabric. But if I try to color in or shade within the lines of every little bit of the drawing that I had, it would take me forever and it would feel very tight and too careful and orderly. And I know I would just kind of be too gentle and trying to perfectly follow within the lines. It's much better to be a little loose, especially early on. You got nothing to lose early here in the drawing that we can't bring back. And we can always cut back and bring more specific edges back to our shapes. And remember, this is just the vine charcoal stage, so we're going to be coming in with much bolder, darker charcoal here in a minute. So now's not the time to be too worried about or too uptight about losing the edges of shapes. We're going to bring those edges back in later. The big thing is we don't want it to feel like there's a hazy glow around everything. And if you notice, this cup now is starting to pop out a little bit. Now I could always darken the background a little bit around the cup and it would make it pop even more. But that cup is really starting to glow because, not because there's a line there, but because there's an edge between light and dark. So remember, edges are more important than lines right now in a value drawing. And I know we talked about that last week too. Okay, so starting to get a feel of where the light's coming from. We'll hopefully even bring that out more soon. So let me bring in a couple more big shapes within the background and bring those wrinkle kind of shapes in the fabric back to the fore. All right, guys, so definitely by no means perfect. And that's, if there's anything I want you to take away from this, it is that nothing will appear accurate and 100% right early on, nor should it. It should be a loose work in progress at this point. But big shapes are starting to merge. Light source is starting to come together. We know because of the shadow shapes that the light's coming down in this direction. That's all good. I've started to bring in the shapes of the fabric flow back here. That's really important not to leave that out for too long. Too many times students, I notice this in classes, that students totally neglect the background, get these beautiful apples and a mug, and then have rendered it for 5 hours and then realize, oh shoot, I didn't do anything back here. And now I have to come back and tidy up around my objects. And for that reason, you'll notice a glow where people don't want to, like a halo around the shapes, where people don't want to come back and touch up the edges because you don't want to mess up what you've been working on. So it's better to start this background now than to wait forever on that. So now that I've gotten a pretty decent idea of my structure of the light, I'm going to come back in with that compressed charcoal, the really dark stuff, and I'm going to try to find those key areas where I've got some seriously dark marks in my apples. And again, the apples, because they're a deep red in the shadow, there's a much bolder, darker tone in these left side of the apples than there is, say, in the white objects. So I'm going to bring those out a little stronger, and I think it'll bring the structure out much more clearly here in just a second. See if you agree with me. All right, so I'm definitely bringing up even more detail in this apple, the mug, soon this apple I'll do the same thing. But notice how much more believable the light is feeling, or starting to feel, on this. Now I haven't done anything on these edges, but I'll clean those up in a second. But that highlight to the middle tones, to the deeper tones, to the darkest, it's really starting to come along and feel a little bit more believable. And that's mostly because I've just really paid attention to edges, to how things blend and fade into one another, and tried to think about that idea of the hierarchy or structure of light across a rounded form, because that's all this is. An apple is just a slightly more complicated spherical shape. So the highlight is the only thing that's pure white. It aggressively starts to get deeper and darker pretty soon after, and then really darker across that deep shadow core over here. There's going to be a bit of reflection because there's a white tablecloth, so down in this lower edge through this area, there's definitely going to be some reflection in the apple, and that's what's going to make it start to feel a little bit shiny. You just have to be careful not to make it feel so reflected that the light down here contrasts or competes with the light up here. So you don't want this to be more contrasty right here than way up there. That's the star of the show. That's where the light hits that apple the hardest. So keep that in mind as we keep playing around with this. And I'm going to make this highlight up here feel the same way. That's the brightest, most jarring spot on this apple, somewhere right around here on the corner, and that nothing else quite competes with it.